afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us today. Just making sure you are all awake and not napping after lunch. And if there's any dogs in the room, they probably also heard that. Um, my name is Amy Harder. I'm executive editor of Cypher. We're a news publication covering climate technologies. Please go to our website to check it out, cyphernews.com. I'm here with an incredible panel to talk about the tech sector that's still on the rise, implying that perhaps some other tech companies have had some challenges. And we're going to have a conversation up here for about 45 minutes, but as you may have seen from other breakouts, we very much want you to participate and ask questions. So please be thinking of things you'd like to ask, and we'll get to audience questions toward the end of our conversation. To introduce my panelists, immediately to my left, I have Caroline Cochran, COO of Oklo, Ramya Swaminathan, CEO of Malta, and Derek Warnick, CFO and co-founder of Electric Hydrogen. I'm guessing most of us probably don't know exactly what each of these companies do. So we're going to do sort of an opening lightning round where each of you can try to summarize in a couple of sentences what your company does and why it matters for the folks gathered here today. Caroline?
Thanks, Amy. Excited to be here. Yes, I'm from Oklo Inc. I'm the co-founder and COO, and what we do is use advanced fission to create clean, reliable, and affordable power. What is advanced fission? Well, fission is when neutrons hit atoms and split them. The energy that comes out of that is millions of times more energy dense than typical combustion reactions. So that's where the power and the ability to make incredible amounts of power with emission-free characteristics comes from. So maybe that's the shortest way to describe it.
That's great, and we will dive into a bit of that in the next few minutes. But Ramya?
Thanks for having me, Amy. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Ramya Swaminathan. I am the CEO of Malta. We are developing an energy storage technology that stores electricity in the form of molten salt. Why energy storage? Well, a remarkable fact is that wind and solar are the most cheap forms of electricity generation at the moment. And that's a remarkable fact for the climate. But they're not always available. They're what's called intermittent. The sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow. So electricity storage is absolutely necessary to take these intermittent sources of power and make them firm and available when needed on the grid.
I'm Derek Warnick. I'm the CFO of Electric Hydrogen. So we make the world's most powerful and efficient hydrogen electrolyzer system, which splits water using renewable energy to create hydrogen, which can be used as a substitute for fossil fuels. We make molecules to decarbonize our world.
So I want to ask a broad question that really gets at the name of this panel, which is the tech sector that is still on the rise. Of course, many of us have seen the layoffs at a lot of the well-known tech companies. Can we get an observation from each of you on the state of the climate tech investment space? Is it still going strong? Ramya, maybe we'll start with you.
Absolutely. So it is still going strong. And in fact, I would argue that it's among the most robust and resilient investment spaces in climate tech. Now, I think one thing to recognize is that technology is one thing, but the markets are still developing. And that's certainly true for long duration storage, which is the sector I'm in, and I'm sure you'll hear from my fellow panelists about their market spaces. But investment interest remains strong in anticipation of markets that support these amazing technologies.
My mic. Okay. I'll add to that a bit too. I think, tech is such a broad word. And when you think about software versus the energy space, which we're all three in, it's just such different spaces. Energy, of course, being the biggest market by far in the world. And right now there's the need for energy is only growing. And even you can subset out different sectors that are just growing massively, let alone the whole global energy market. So I think it's incredible to see where that's going.
So many of us may be aware of another conference going on this week. A quick raise of hands. Who here is familiar with or has been to Zero Week? Okay, not that many hands, but it's important to mention here because, that's Zero Week is this big, mostly oil and gas funded conference in Houston. And it's really the beating heart of the energy industry as we've typically known it, which is fossil fuels. This conference being held the same week is really becoming the beating heart of the climate community. But really, those two things are one and the same, one could argue. And I would love to hear from each of our panelists, which I know all of you have some team members there, or maybe you're heading there, or you've been there. Talk about sort of how we need, to what degree we need to engage the traditional fossil fuel companies for a solution to climate while balancing what is a lot of emotional, a lot of emotions around maybe what oil companies have funded and opposed over the years.
That with a very Malta-specific answer. So our technology basically takes components that have been used in traditional fossil power generation spaces, like turbomachinery, basically a gas compressor, a steam turbine integrated on a single shaft. We use heat exchangers. And to the grid, our plant looks and feels, operates very much like a combined cycle gas plant. The reason all of that is relevant background for my answer to Amy's question is one of the places where we see a lot of resonance with our customers is in repurposing retiring or retired fossil assets. So one of the trends that's happening globally is that coal in particular, coal-fired generation is retiring globally. And some gas-fired assets are retiring as well. And there remains a very large possibility to take those assets that are retiring, retrofit them with a Malta plant, which would provide to the grid at the same point that it traditionally has received these services, the kinds of ancillary services to the grid that were provided by traditional fossil assets. So for us, really, we see a big nexus with traditional industries, and it really needs to be said that one of the places that is really important to this community and to all communities is the opportunity to incorporate those incumbent workers. So one of the things that happens as we transition to a clean energy economy is the dislocation of workers across all parts of the value chain associated with traditional fossil assets. And so one of the places that we at Malta really see a just transition happening is the ability to site a Malta plant on the site of a retiring coal plant and incorporate those existing workers to result in them saving their jobs and really preserving the value, economic values to their communities.
Down in Houston for Zero Week, hydrogen is all the rage. Can you talk about how you see hydrogen from a business perspective, particularly looking from sort of a fossil fuel transition perspective?
Sure. I think what's important to bear in mind, at least from our perspective, is to think about the amount of infrastructure that already exists to move energy globally. There are trillions of dollars of infrastructure that are currently in place to move energy-containing gases and liquids. The world evolved that way because energy-containing gases and liquids are an effective medium to move energy around, and historically they've been very low cost. I think that one of the reasons why hydrogen is so exciting is because we know how to move energy-containing gases and liquids. And hydrocarbons, hydrogen is obviously the key part of that puzzle, aside from the carbon that ends up becoming CO2. So when we think about the opportunity for green hydrogen to have a massive impact, if you're able to take intermittent renewables like solar and wind, convert that into a molecule for energy, it can be transported in many cases much more easily. It also provides an opportunity to get electricity into parts of the industrial economy that currently won't work. Chemical energy is actually a very large use of energy globally. So that's everything from fertilizers to the entire chemical industry. That is a large impact on kind of global carbon footprint. So we like to think about the opportunity to repurpose existing infrastructure. There is definitely, an argument to be said, well, that allows fossil fuel companies to continue operations and whatnot. I think it's disingenuous to believe that fossil fuel companies are going to just disappear. They are businesses that are going to find a way to pivot, hopefully, to something much cleaner, much sooner. So I don't view it as necessarily a bad thing to provide them an opportunity to change their business through economics. And I guess that's the biggest thing that we're targeting is a solution that is not adopted because it's better and greener, but because it's cheaper and it's greener. That's the opportunity here, is to really guide with the economics, which will allow things to transition much more quickly.
That's a great question, Amy. I was going to say something honestly All right. There it goes. All right. I was going to say something sort of similar to what Derek was saying, which is, you got to make economic sense. But getting back to your original question, Amy, I think it's such an interesting question, like the tension that we see there, which is like, there's the world that we see that's real, which has, oil companies making some of their biggest revenues of all time, realistically, and wanting to make a difference. I see that in my own team where, they're joining my team because they want to be part of providing clean energy to communities. But I think like Derek said, you have to make dollars and cents. And then I think the role of especially people here at Aspen Climate is to create that demand signal. So when, oil companies see that demand, they see that not only individual consumers, but individual consumers are pushing big consumers such as Amazon, Microsoft, you name it, big companies that also make commitments to low carbon or emission-free energy, then they want to be part of making that happen because they see that demand pull and if the economics make sense, they want to be part of providing those products. So that's where we see kind of an intersection there, right? Like obviously our mission is to bring emission-free power, but if we do it in partnership with oil companies that want to bring emission-free power to their customers, maybe for now it's a niche set, but hopefully it grows. That's kind of where we see some interesting interactions.
Industry has kind of come to the forefront of our debate. Just making sure that you can hear me in the back. I can also talk louder if that's helpful. Great, got some thumbs up. And is Russia's war into Ukraine that has really catapulted both the vulnerability that we feel with fossil fuels, but also the urgency to get off them completely. And it really has just completely shaken so many things in the energy industry. I'd love to hear from each of you about how this energy crisis has impacted your business for better or worse. Maybe Ramya, we'll start with you.
Absolutely, and I think it's a great question and one of kind of the revolutionary impacts in this industry, right, across its global footprint. For us, what we saw is that the combination of renewables plus electricity storage really changed as a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine from being a matter just of decarbonization, because that's the way you can decarbonize the grid, to also being a solution to energy security and energy independence, right? And that achieved really enormous impact and importance in the policy debate, particularly in Europe over the last year and a half or so as the impacts of the Russian war in Ukraine have been felt. But interestingly, I think that same debate and importance given to energy independence, energy security is being felt here in the United States, not only because of natural gas, where there isn't as much of a sensitivity, but in terms of dependence on foreign countries, particularly ones that can be hostile for rare earth metals, minerals, other commodities that at some point in the future can be held hostage. So we really see this as an important part of supply chain management in terms of energy security and energy independence.
Yeah, I think I'll also just add that the situation in Ukraine has also kind of highlighted the energy independence aspect that Ramya has just mentioned, but I think that ties into what the concept of sustainability actually is, and thinking about the concept of generating energy that you can count on, and you can deploy capital and generate more renewables and deploy that into additional infrastructure. That's something that when you're beholden to pumping dinosaurs out of the ground, you can't rely on that forever, and particularly if you don't have those resources in your country, you may not be able to rely on that even tomorrow. So sustainability is not just something that's good for the environment. It can also be good from an economic perspective, but certainly from an energy security standpoint, if you do have renewable resources in your country, like the US does and Europe does to a lesser extent, there's a big opportunity there to create a little bit more independence to keep your economy going if bad things happen.
Caroline, I'd love to hear from you. Nuclear power has really seen a resurgence in support of all types, right? Keeping existing nuclear power plants open and consideration for advanced kinds. How has it affected your company specifically? Have you changed anything because of the energy crisis in Europe?
Yeah, no, it's so multidimensional. I just keep contemplating which thing to bring up first. I think to Derek's point, the global supply chain of all types has just come to the fore, both through COVID and through the Ukrainian invasion, the invasion of Ukraine. Um, it's interesting to see how we have to kind of adapt to that. I think the solution can't be that we don't want to have supply chain elements in other countries, which are essential for I'd say most renewables. But it's also kind of made evident how resilient is your power. I think one of the benefits of renewables is that solar panels can keep producing power for many years. Same with wind and so forth, and actually same for nuclear. So for our power plants that we're developing, we can produce power for 10 to 20 years on the same core load of fuel, and that's really important for the resiliency for different communities and different customers we're serving, which is like you can be more immune to major disruptions like we're seeing in the past. And also the scale that, and this is Oklo specific, the scale that we're looking at, in addition, being small scale and potentially looking at having more small scale plants that are community size, you might say, instead of one big plant that if something happened to it, it knocks out power for a large number of people. So I think having a more resilient grid means having more distributed, more independent power sources that can supply power to people.
I want to come back to that in just a moment, but before we leave this topic of the energy crisis, would love just to very quickly hear from Ramya and Derek. Have you guys increased business, or are you looking more to Europe because of what happened?
We are. So we had always focused on Europe as one of our primary market areas for our initial deployments. And we have intensified that focus as a result of the real need to offer alternatives to natural gas.
I would say yes and no. And that's because in addition to issues that are occurring in Europe now from an energy security standpoint, there's also the Inflation Reduction Act that passed here in the U.S. along the same time frame. So I would say energy security has now made renewably produced hydrogen economic against fossil fuels today, and it's likely to stay that way for the foreseeable future. Likewise, in the U.S., the Inflation Reduction Act has created a 10-year period where renewably produced hydrogen, green hydrogen, is economic versus fossil fuels, and in many cases cheaper. And over time, as the industry develops and we produce more of our product, which is a 100 megawatt electrolyzer system, very large industrial scale, we believe that we'll be able to maintain pricing below fossil parity for the foreseeable future, even if the subsidies in the U.S. Come off earlier. So we have had more focus on Europe. It's just our attention has now been drawn back to the U.S. For other reasons.
That's not what Europe wants to hear. If you read the headlines, Europe is terrified all the companies will leave that continent and come to the U.S. for the Inflation Reduction Act. And so let's dig into that a little bit. And maybe, Derek, we'll stick with you. Looking specifically at hydrogen, I've heard from some folks that the hydrogen subsidy is almost too good. Is there any part of you that could agree with that statement?
So I would say there's two I guess maybe kind of loaded points in that. One, for the regulation in the Inflation Reduction Act is called 45V. It is a price per dollars of kilogram produced, which is equal to $3 per kilogram if you can produce hydrogen with no carbon footprint. That, in addition to the actual value that you receive when you sell the hydrogen, because aside from the tax credit, you still have value to that commodity you're producing. Those together start to pencil out to saying, hey, this could be extraordinarily competitive with fossil fuels. I think it's important to recognize that each component of the supply chain and everyone involved in the production of hydrogen, from electrolyzer manufacturers like ourselves to renewables developers and whatnot, will each be able to capture value in that chain. So if all of that tax credit were to flow to one part, it would be hugely distortive and might make hydrogen appear like it's free. But that's not what ends up happening with things like this. Everyone involved in the supply chain ends up making a little bit more money, and it enables the economics to work. Without this, they wouldn't work at all. And if the tax credit were to be smaller, the economics would start to be potentially challenging in certain markets. So there'd be less opportunity for companies to get out at the forefront and say, hey, look, there's big money to potentially be made I'll take a chance off of deploying green hydrogen in an area that you otherwise wouldn't. I think the other side of the IRA that people talk about is that there is a component for blue hydrogen and carbon capture, and people have created some argument that maybe there's too much support given for the transition from fossil fuel industries to get greener and things of that nature. I think that's something that at least we feel is actually a good attribute because it creates some durability to these tax credits no matter what happens with administration changes in the future. If there's an opportunity for everyone to be excited about transitioning to do something that's cleaner and greener and an opportunity to make money, that means that this has a chance of sticking around without there being fierce opposition, let's say in a couple of years if the administration were to change and everything gets unwound. That would be really tough for people to make economic decisions on if they didn't think they could rely on it.
Are you saying that because blue hydrogen and, raise your hand if you're familiar with the hydrogen rainbow? Okay, that's a good chunk of us, but not all of us. Different colors denote different sources of energy for the hydrogen, and blue hydrogen, of course, is fossil fuel, is natural gas with carbon capture. And is what you're implying, Derek? Basically, Republicans like fossil fuels, and they'll keep it around if we have a President Trump, for example.
Potentially, I don't pretend to know what would happen on the political front. I think the best thing to do is to allow new technologies to compete. I think that relying on fossil fuels economically is not going to make sense over the long term. In the short term, if providing an opportunity to clean up the industry some helps the transition occur, I don't think it's a bad thing.
Really, everything that the IRA is doing is really just accelerating transitions that are already underway. And it's about economics, as Derek said. So turning to you, Ramya, what is the state of the long duration LDES for short, which makes me think LDS and other things that are definitely not long duration energy storage? Can you talk about how does this change the game for a company like yours?
Absolutely. And yes, we certainly need to come up with something that doesn't overlap with LDS. But LDES, what Amy is referring to, is long duration energy storage. So just to be clear, long duration refers to the length of time that you can discharge the electricity storage for. So there's no common accepted definition of what long duration is. But broadly speaking, when we think about short duration, you're talking about single digit hours, 1 hour, 2 hours, maybe up to 4 or 5 hours. Some people would define long duration as anything over 10 hours. And then there's seasonal storage, which is certainly long duration, but it's really at one end of the spectrum, right? So broadly speaking, when people talk about long duration energy storage, the LDES Council defines it as over 10 hours. So if we accept that definition for a moment, I think one of the critical challenges that actually is not necessarily addressed by the IRA is really the development of the market. So energy storage provides a lot of value to the grid. It time shifts electricity, like I was talking about. You can take wind or solar that's sometimes available and shift it to times where it's needed. It provides values to the grid without getting too technical about it. There's a lot of stuff that energy generation provides to the grid that is needed to maintain the frequency, the reliability, the resiliency, and in a traditional world, a lot of those services were provided by fossil fuel assets. And electricity grids, kind of globally, were also architected so that they kind of functioned in silos. There were loads, which is people who use power. There are generators, which is people who discharge power into the grid. There's transmission. And one of the issues for electricity storage is that it has qualities of all of these things. And traditionally, electricity grids don't really allow you to be multiple things. They want you to be one thing. And so that remains a challenge. It's not addressed by the IRA. The IRA, however, does provide significant economic incentives in the form of a standalone storage tax credit and in terms of other incentives as well, including non-dilutive funding through several grant programs. So the hope is that for long duration storage, there's enough of a cost competitiveness when combined with generation like wind and solar today to be competitive with something like natural gas. So I know that was a very long-winded answer, but it really speaks to the nascency of the market.
So what if this sort of missing puzzle piece isn't addressed in the IRA, how and who should be addressing it? Is it still the federal government, or is it sort of a patchwork of grid operators and other entities? How do we solve
How do we solve that problem? So that depends a lot on who you're talking about. So in the United States, we do not have a national grid. We do not have a grid in which the rules are the same no matter where you are and there's a single payer or anything like that, right? So there's a patchwork of vertically integrated utilities. There are ISOs where electricity is traded. And so it depends is sort of the short answer, right? So the federal government has a meaningful role to play in the sense that FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, has already said to the traded markets that they need to value all the services that storage provides to the grid. The cost subsidies that are prevalent in the IRA are super helpful in making the case that long duration storage is economic and can climb down the cost curve. But there is a lot of market design work that needs to happen, and it is very complex because it's not one party.
Yeah, I think a lot of our eyes might glaze over when we talk about MISO and FERC, and I'm forgetting all the other acronyms, but there's a lot of them. And maybe we'll get into that in a few minutes. But Caroline, I would love to turn to you. What does the IRA do for a company like Oklo and other advanced nuclear power companies?
Yeah, we're really excited about the IRA. I think the industry, when I say we, the industry is really excited. And it's a very nascent industry when you think of, I'm sorry, I'm quiet. I think one of the key things for us is actually supply chain. So rich fuel that's required. So the IRA actually has some money in there for that. It's more of like your turn on Amy. Okay. It has all the battery, by the way. Okay. Yeah, the supply chain is key. And that's where some IRA investment dollars are going, which people are excited about. There's also production and investment tax credits for investment in advanced fission, so that's also quite exciting.
I want to ask you about the economics of nuclear power. First of all, another audience participation opportunity, so get your hands ready. Raise your hand. I asked this in a plenary session this morning, so if you were there, you're going to get the same question. Raise your hand if you consider nuclear power a climate solution. Okay. A solution, yes. So that's most people. I won't make the people who disagree with that statement raise their hand. But suffice to say, there's a friendly room for nuclear power. But one of the persistent and questions that faces nuclear power of all kinds, existing and advanced, is the cost. And I understand, but please correct me if I'm translating this incorrectly, that you're going very small to be able to make it more affordable, whereas typical nuclear power is you go very big to get economies of scale. Talk about how that is enabling Oklo to be more cost effective than perhaps the conventional wisdom would suggest.
Yeah. This is like actually one of my favorite questions because we didn't coordinate this, I don't think. Because the conventional wisdom is the bigger you get, the more like effective, like levelized cost you get over time, right? Out of something. That's what the big, what we call water cooled plants. So they require a lot of water to cool. They're huge, many billion-dollar projects. People are very excited. I'm excited too because one of them is finally coming online, but I think it's been like 20 years of construction, many billions of dollars, I think over 20 at this point. And there's so many things to unwrap there. But I think one of the biggest keys that we're really focused on is the size, which I'll get to in a second, but having inherent safety characteristics. If you design with a technology that, one, has already been well proven out for 30 years in research reactors in Idaho, but also was well proven to have safety characteristics such that if you shut off all of the power to the plant, you shut off all the cooling, you keep the control rods locked out of the core, and it just shuts itself down, that's the technology we wanted to work with, because then if you have inherent safety, you don't need all these belts and suspenders, as you might say, to keep it safe. And then that's where a lot of the costs actually are. And then that ties into quality assurance, which I'm sure everyone's eyes is going to glaze over at this point. But when you have to have this thing be what's called safety related and this thing be safety related, and actually at big plants, there's tens of thousands of parts that are all safety related, which means they're required to keep the plant safe. Each one of those has to have what's called nuclear grade quality assurance, which can mean it actually is thousands of times more expensive than a similar component, even with excellent quality assurance, let's say ISO 9000 or whatever, in the market. So if you take out all those things that have thousands of multiples of expense on them, like I feel like in my generation, you probably heard about like $10,000 toilets or something in the military or something. I feel like that was a thing like 20 years ago. But anyway, like, those kinds of quality assurance or special procurement that ends up multiplying costs way more than it should for various reasons. And maybe there are reasons for it. We wanted to cut all those out, not because we're cutting corners, but because it's inherently safe. And then start with a small enough size that we could build, own, and operate it. Because what we're finding is customers don't want to build, own, and operate a nuclear power plant. They want clean, reliable power that's affordable. And so we can sell that to them. We build, own, and operate the power plant. And that's much more doable if you're talking about the size scale. But there are some things about the size that actually also, I believe, inherently make it less expensive, not just the technology, which is what I was just talking about. So why would we start at such a small scale? And a lot of people are like, one, you're not going to make a dent. Two, it's going to be more expensive than a big plant. Why would you do that? And what we've seen is actually at small scales, you can make arguments, again, because of safety, but also because of size, that you don't need whole categories of costs. Like I was talking about QA, but also like different levels of security. Like research reactors don't have like 50 armed guards at their plants because they simply don't need it. They are much smaller in size and inherently protected. So like those kinds of things are just fundamentally different at our size scale and with our technology. So it's kind of like, it nullifies that question that I actually get a lot, which is like, you're going to be too expensive to matter.
Thanks so much for that answer. I want to kind of look beyond the Inflation Reduction Act. We've been hearing a lot about the importance of that. Equally important, though, according to John Podesta, the White House advisor, and others, is getting some sort of permitting reform passed. And this is pretty controversial because, Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia wants to approve fossil fuel projects, along with a lot of other Republicans as well. And that's, perhaps a debate for another day in room. But for the panelists we have up here on stage, how is the permitting process going for your companies? How could it be streamlined? What could the government do to make this a better, both the federal government and also local governments and local entities do to make this a better process while not bulldozing over community and environmental concerns? Ramya, maybe start with you and your experience.
Absolutely. And in the electricity industry generally, and I imagine actually that this is going to be a common issue, permitting is one thing, which is sort of environmental and construction permits, et cetera. I want to talk about that. But the thing I really want to emphasize is that the interconnection, the permits to interconnect to the grid are actually the key stumbling block for greenfield projects around the United States. And in many places, interconnection queues are taking not 2 and 3 years. I'm talking 5, 7, maybe even 10 years. In MISO North, there has not been a large generator interconnection application that has been approved in the last 2 to 3 years.
And is that like the Midwest?
Yes,
Upper Midwest?
the upper Midwest is that area that I'm talking about. That is
For those who may not know MISO.
Yeah, that's MISO North. That is a major stumbling block, not just for our company and our technology, but for generators, electricity generators of all kinds in the entire United States. And if I had to identify one issue that needs to be solved, and again, remember, we don't have a single national electricity market with a national set of rules for how to interconnect to a grid. It really depends on where you are and who the system operator is and what the utilities are in that space, et cetera. But this is a common problem, and I would highlight this as being an absolute essential and one where actually, the federal government has some agency, but it really does need to be solved in an individual, kind of regional and system-specific way.
Let's take a beat on that. So, are you as a company, waiting in a queue as well?
It's a great question. So I'm going to refer back to one of the answers I gave a little earlier. So one of the advantages that we have is that it's very easy to take a Malta plant and site it on the site of a retiring coal or gas plant. And so one of the ways in which we've been able to solve this problem for ourselves, although this is not fully scalable, it's a solution for the near term, is to really focus on repurposing retiring fossil assets. Because why? They have an existing interconnection to the grid, right? So
You're sort of like cutting in the line.
yes, if you want to think about it that way, right? But in the best possible way. And so that is something that we are very intentionally thinking about and doing strategically. But that's not really a solution for the electricity grid writ large and for all technologies and for all projects. It is possible in those particular cases, but this problem needs a solution, and I believe it's a dire problem.
Derek, I want to go to you. What kind of permitting and regulatory challenges and steps does a hydrogen facility have to go through? I mean, you're clearly dealing with other issues perhaps that are adjacent to what Ramya was talking about, but can you help solve some of these? Can you take some of this renewable energy that has nowhere to go and make renewable hydrogen with it?
I think that's one of the most interesting opportunities with green hydrogen generation is that if the technology is flexible so that it can ramp up and down, this is really a dispatchable source of demand. And one of the biggest issues right now in the U.S., Rami absolutely nailed it, interconnection queue is a big deal. But the other side of that is new transmission is very challenging to build, and what happens is you get pockets of renewables that the economics make sense, they build a bunch of renewables, and then the transmission lines get overloaded, and the only reason you stop building renewables someplace is because you end up with a lot of congestion, power pricing drops or goes negative at times, the economics don't work, you stop building additional renewables there. Kind of the line that I use is they didn't run out of wind in Iowa, Chicago can't use any more electricity. So the resource is still available in many places. And so when we think about the last part of your question there, Amy, we do think about our systems being a potentially really important part of adding value to renewables. Aside from producing a valuable commodity in green hydrogen, they also can serve a purpose of taking, let's say, a pocket of a couple 100 megawatts of wind. If there was dispatchable demand that could be turned on when pricing is getting low, the wind is blowing very heavily, you could eliminate the constraint so that that line is operating at 90% of capacity instead of what would have been 105% of capacity. That's when you get negative power pricing. That's when renewables are disincentivized to continue to build. So electrolyzers are something that can absolutely do that. I think the other side of this, as we look at the interconnection problem, is this is the biggest thing standing between additional renewable deployment. One of the ways that we think about it too is it possible for us to partner with renewable assets and not have them interconnected to the grid at all? Can we sit next to a wind farm that's being built in the middle of nowhere that might have access to, let's say, a natural gas pipeline? Can green hydrogen be blended in and provide the same decarbonization potential utilizing different forms of transmission? And I think that's something that few people realize is that the natural gas transmission grid in the U.S. actually has plenty of capacity available in it and can move the amount of energy in the form of gigawatt hours or whatnot you need to nominate it in that's necessary to provide for a lot more renewable deployment. The problem is that siting wires, siting electrical transmission is actually much more complicated and difficult than it is to build pipelines. So that's a little understood fact that I think is going to become more and more apparent here in the coming years.
Derek, you're touching on potentially, or you're adjacent to a pretty wonky but important topic, and another survey of the room. Raise your hand if you know about additionality, or if you've heard that. Oh, okay, that's about maybe a third of the room. Derek, can you talk about what that is in as simple of terms as possible, and why is it important?
Sure. I think there is a conversation right now going on related to the tax credits for green hydrogen production in general, and then a couple of other facets where there's discussion about whether or not renewable energy actually is new and additional to the grid versus something that was already there. I think that it's incredibly important that we're providing the right economic incentives. And I don't mean this, they have to be tax credit and subsidies. We're building our company to operate entirely subsidy free. There's no long-term prospect of building a successful company that's reliant on government support. What I'm saying is that the economic incentives need to be clear for new renewables to be able to be built. And one of those is those green attributes that are typically now traded via renewable energy certificates, RECs. There's a potential problem now where you have a wind farm that was already built, and the power that's being produced is so cheap that it's clearing the market on its own, and those green attributes have very little value. There are some that believe that it makes sense to then say, okay, well, let me buy those green attributes that right now have little value and aren't really going to use. Let me buy them, attach them to some other project that's located someplace else, and all of a sudden I'm generating green electricity or green hydrogen and whatnot for a project that has no relation to the renewable project in question, and there's no additionality. I think that's a big problem. I think the cleanest way to deal with this, or the clearest way to deal with this over the long term, is to grow the market. If you're providing economic opportunities and incentives to develop more renewables, they're going to come to market. Part of that will be the economics from power production. Part of that will be the economics from the renewable attributes. But no matter how you do this, it doesn't make sense to shuffle around existing resources and then allow that to be an opportunity to kind of monetize something so that you're using fossil fuels and attaching it to a wind farm thousands of miles away and claiming that creates some positive benefit. I think it's a challenging argument to make.
We're going to go to questions from you in the audience in a few minutes. Oh, we already see a couple hands go up, so we have eager beavers, so very good to know. That's exciting. We will come to you in just a moment, but before we get there, Carolyn, I want to come back to you and talk about the regulatory environment for advanced nuclear power. It's my understanding that there has been no advanced nuclear power, or maybe one new scale that has gotten conditional approval from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Talk about what that process is going to be like for Oklo and the challenges there.
Yeah, I thought it was so interesting that when you asked the question about regulatory reform and permitting reform, it's a bit of a Rorschach question, I think, because it makes each person sees in that question the thing that's facing them the most. And I heard about the interconnection issues, which is a little bit fascinating to me because I happen to have solar panels on my manufactured home that we live in California, and they're still not interconnected, but they're producing power for us. It's so far great for me, I guess not so great for everybody else. But in nuclear industry, the first question, other than are you too expensive to matter, is how long will it take to get your plant approved? And it is an interesting question to me, also because we're not the only kind of power that has lengthy regulatory timelines, given the interconnection issues. I was talking with some small utility in Alaska. We were up there. They drove us around. We saw this tiny little water hydro plant that was just kind of like a little pump on the side of a river, right? And that took them 10 years. And so it's a challenge across the board. So I guess I'm pointing out that we're not the only ones. But when I think of that question, I think of both NEPA and, of course, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which you bring up. I was once asking, and I might be repeating something that's wrong, but I was asking around with people who seem to know, which is who does NEPA apply to? And I thought it was really fascinating.
National Environmental Policy Act.
I guess, thank you. Yes,
Just
using acronyms. So NEPA reviews are environmental reviews for major federal actions that generally power related. So power lines and power plants can be affected by it. And
It's what brought down Keystone. I'm sure all of us remember that.
So legal challenges to improperly done NEPA reviews can be a major way to challenge projects that people don't want to go through, for sure. I think it's interesting that I heard back that oil and gas almost never has to do NEPA. Renewables sometimes do. Nuclear always does. And it seems quite, I don't know about, almost inverse of what it should be. Because if you're talking about emission-free power sources, often are always having to go through it, and some of the highest emission sources never having to go through it. It seems bizarre in the first place. But yet when you bring up NEPA review, NEPA reform, environmentalists might knee-jerk say, well, we want environmental reviews. So I think it's a challenging topic to kind of make both sides happy and make sure that clean power plants are being built, both renewable and nuclear. But I'll get to NRC, but it sounds like you have a thing.
Oh, I don't want to cut you off if you have one more thing to say.
Yeah. So NRC, the regulations that are written around those large water-cooled plants. We're doing a small, completely different fuel. We're using nuclear waste as fuel, like tiny advanced reactor. But the fact is they've worked with us. We're the only company that's actually gotten to combined license stage. So NuScale's done the design certification, but they're still gonna have to do the combined license after that. So what we're doing is a design review with a combined license in one. It was rejected last year. We're doing it again. And so you just have to keep trying. But what we've seen is a lot of progress in a lot of areas. So I guess I wouldn't be doing this if I didn't think it was doable.
That's great. Would love to go out into the audience. I think we have a mic going around. And as a reminder, please state your name and state the question in the form of a question so we can get in as many as we can.
Hi, thank you very much. I've learned a lot already but I got a couple of questions on the process. And you all going to Houston, I hope, to talk with the crowd there. What I understood, what I heard you say is both of you have alternative fuels to create power, and so you can take a power plant that's fed. You got a refinery, got an oil refinery, and then you go to that power plant and say, okay, you're not going to receive oil anymore. You're going to receive hydrogen. And I think what I heard you say was they still can use a lot of the equipment in that power plant, like heat exchangers and things like that. That's what I thought I heard you say. That you're not just creating a new power plant because it has to burn hydrogen or whatever alternative. You're actually making the most of that existing power plant and just changing out some of the equipment in the chain. Is that accurate?
Sure. I'll start on that. I think there's a couple of different kind of distinct areas there. I think on our end, we're utilizing renewable energy to split water and make hydrogen through an electrolyzer system. That hydrogen can be a substitute in many large industrial processes for natural gas, or there's also a huge amount of industrial use right now for gray hydrogen or hydrogen derived from fossil fuels. So we are able to leverage a lot of existing infrastructure in that way. Power plants could use hydrogen to generate electricity. That might make sense in some cases, but if you're going from electricity into hydrogen and then back into power, that might make more sense, for instance, for Ramya's technology of actually storing the electricity utilizing the existing power plant. So I think we're a little bit more on kind of industrial usage. I think Ramya is a little bit more on maybe the storage of energy. So if maybe you want to cover that.
Yeah. So
Sorry, but I thought we were exchanging an oil-driven power plant to an alternative-driven power plant.
right. So we actually see it mostly with coal and gas. But the idea is the same, right? So you've got an existing power plant. It typically combusts some kind of fossil fuel. And you can take that plant, retire it, and put a Malta plant right on the spot. And the ability to use the equipment depends on the age and the condition of that equipment, but it's certainly possible.
And both of our companies and both of our technologies are actually driven by renewable electricity. So it's not, Malta's technology isn't going to run off of hydrogen. Either of us would run off of solar or wind. We'd produce molecules in the form of hydrogen. They would
Produce electrons.
store electricity in square form, and they have different use cases, right? If you have electricity and you want electricity, storing it makes a lot of sense there. If you want to move into a different process that right now can't utilize electricity, or if you want to transport essentially renewable energy very large distances, turning into hydrogen and pumping in a pipeline makes lots of sense. So I think there's maybe a couple different applications there.
Okay, so if you're running this power plant that's been living on refined oil, then what is this easiest for you if that's your job? If you're running that power plant and they spend a lot of time and money building it.
I think we're both very much on the same page that if you can repurpose existing infrastructure, there's a lot of benefit there because ripping and replacing trillions of dollars of infrastructure is going to be really challenging. Yeah.
Yeah, real quick. I think everybody in this room has got to be impressed with how articulate the three of you are and what you're doing. It would seem that for you to be successful, there have to be equivalently entrepreneurial and smart thinkers on the regulatory side. But I bet they're going into businesses like yours. Are there people in government, at the federal, whatever level it might be, who can manage what you're giving them and understand how best to leverage it?
I was just going to say, from your lips to God's ears, as they say. But I mean, I think your point is exactly right, which is, this energy transition is going to require everybody, right? So you've got representatives here from technologies, and behind us stand capital, right? Because all our companies are funded. So you've got a lot of people pouring a lot of capital into innovative technologies. But for the energy transition to be successful, it's not enough to have great technologies, right? You can have great, terrific technologies, but if the deployment of those technologies is inhibited by poor regulation, by poor market design, and by never being able to climb down the cost curve, it's not going to matter that you've got great technology. So I hear the question and the spirit in which it's intended. I do think there is an enormous amount of interest from federal, state, and local governments in places that we're working, and I'm sure that in where my colleagues are working as well, their hearts are in the right place and they want to change the regulations that, to some extent, it's an artifact of the fact that the regulatory environment was built for, in my case, old grid, right? Like historic grid. And we want them to change the grid, not just for today's grid, but for future grid, right? And so it really requires that anticipation of, not always playing catch up to where we are today, but to anticipate and intentionally design a market and a regulatory framework that is going to result in a grid environment. Again, I'm talking about electricity and only, but results in a grid that is more distributed, more complicated, bi-directional, includes electrons and molecules, and all of those things were just not true in the past, right? So I hear the question in which it's intended. I think there's a lot of partnership there, but this is moving really fast, and we need people to move really fast.
I think the gentleman right there.
Yeah, thank you guys all for coming. This is awesome. My name is Daniel. I'm a senior at Vanderbilt University. This question's for Derek. In an earlier panel, a speaker mentioned that utilities are estimated to underestimate methane leakage by 60 to 70%. If we are going to use a lighter element like hydrogen and transport that in the same infrastructure, how does your company view that problem? It's definitely better than leaking methane, either way, just in terms of their greenhouse effect. But how does your company view it? Is it concerned? How does it measure a leakage like that?
That's a very thoughtful question. I think that what's important is that the existing infrastructure that was designed around natural gas was designed the way that everything was originally put together. The regulatory framework, everything was designed around it being very cheap and having no negative consequences. You pumped it out of the ground and you burned what you could, and if some of it went away, it didn't matter. So from the very beginning, there wasn't a thought, hey, this is super valuable, let's not lose any of it, because it was extraordinarily low cost, and historically in the US has been. But also the environmental consequences of methane as a greenhouse gas, which is something between 80 and 200 times worse than CO2, was certainly not known in the early 1900s. So as you look to deploy hydrogen into infrastructure that might have historically utilized natural gas, I think you have an opportunity to take a fresh look at that and to really monitor things like leakage. I think that the type of infrastructure that's going to be best suited for hydrogen, which is smallest molecule out there, there's very, very tough to contain hydrogen generally, but brand new natural gas pipelines can do that, and they were designed and built with the idea that leakage does matter from a cost perspective and an environmental perspective. So I think it's the best way to view it is it's not a monolith of infrastructure. There's a spectrum of older, kind of low-end infrastructure and brand new infrastructure that can really fit the bill. I think you're going to see transition of that first with new infrastructure that is already planning for things like leakage, kind of from cradle to grave of consumption. I think then you'll probably see replacement of very old infrastructure that you have less capability. So I think it's just important that at the starting point you understand it is a priority, and that's how we view it.
I think we have a question right here.
Thank you very much. What I understand is that you oxidize hydrogen, create heat, run the conventional steam turbine, and create electricity. You do the same with fission. What is it that Malta does, Ramya?
A quick clarification. So we utilize renewable energy to split water to make hydrogen. We don't produce electricity. Our customers want molecular energy, either to run in their process or otherwise. I'll certainly let Ramya answer on your end. Yes, steel processes, ammonia, things of that nature. Yes.
So our company takes electricity from any source. It can be wind or solar or just directly a grid connection. It converts that electric energy into thermal energy, stores it on the hot side in the form of molten salt, and on the cold side in a commodity antifreeze fluid, and it just sits there until it's needed. So think of it like a thermal battery. And then when the electricity is needed back on the grid or for a user, the system essentially reconverts that thermal energy back into electric energy. So it's electricity in, electricity out, and it sits in the form of molten salt and a commodity antifreeze fluid.
I'll just to make it very, very simple, right? Production of carbon-free electricity, storage of carbon-free or renewable electricity, production of green fuels, utilizing carbon-free or renewable electricity.
Well done.
Trying.
Well put. I think we have time for 2 more questions if you make it very quick. And I know we have a lot of hands come up. So if we don't get to your question here, please feel free to, although I know some of us have planes to catch, but catch them on their way out. So why don't we take 3 questions now? And why don't we get the woman also right there after this gentleman? Yes, you with your finger up. Yes. So
Hi.
you ask, and then we'll go straight to you and take 2 at a time.
Hi, I'm Matthew Randazzo. Just a quick correction. NEPA didn't kill Keystone. Native Americans killed Keystone. And I know because I represent and advise Native American tribes for a living. And I've had the honor of killing coal terminals, oil trains, all sorts of industrial projects that didn't respect tribal rights, tribal lands, tribal policy, and ended up in federal court or having state laws preempt them. And I've talked to all sorts of green tech folks this week who talk about land acknowledgements, who talk about diversity and equity. And I asked them the same question, and 95% have the same answer, which is, do you have a binding tribal consultation policy? Do you have partnerships with local indigenous tribes? Are you going to replicate the exact same mistakes that fossil fuel industry made for a century? Thanks.
We won't forget that question. It's a very good one. And then let's take this lady right here, and then we will have to cut it off after that, unfortunately.
Hi, thank you. My name is Julia. I wonder if you could also comment on like the development of off-taker agreements for green hydrogen, but also other technologies as well.
Great, thanks. So let's take the gentleman's question on the indigenous communities first.
Yes, that's so important. And one of the things, for our very first site that we were approved by the Department of Energy to have on, of course, like most land, if not all land in the United States, historically indigenous land. And one of the things that was important to us is consulting with the tribes that have historical artifacts there before making any kinds of announcements. I will say the relationship is complex because we were granted that by the Department of Energy, and we were not allowed to contact the Native nations ourselves because they said it's a nation-to-nation interaction. But we, tried to follow what the protocol is supposed to be and have really made a focus of ours to make sure that we're engaging with them before making any announcements, or at least that they make sure that they understand how to reach out to us if they have questions. But your point is really well taken, and something that we at my company care a lot about. As far as offtake agreements, it's been really fascinating without basically any business development organization up until just like a guy that we hired like 4 months ago or whatever. How many customers come to us because they see that they can just sign a power purchase agreement and get clean power, so we start with letters of interest, engaging with them, and then developing terms and so forth. So we have now signed letters of interest for over 700 megawatts of power. Of course, every state is different, like we've kind of talked about, and every area is different, every country is different. We're working internationally as well. But I guess what I'd say is I found that the ability to produce power and sell directly to customers through power purchase agreements to be a really effective way to bring power to the grid.
Derek, I think the questioner asked specifically about hydrogen as well, so would love to get your quick answer on that.
Yes. So the offtake contracts for any sort of asset that's producing any commodity, electricity or hydrogen or whatnot, are always very important. We produce a very low-cost electrolysis system. Our customers are the ones that are actually generating hydrogen and selling that. But at the end of the day, they have to find a way to finance their project, whether that's on balance sheet, so they're an industrial customer. In that case, the kind of offtake conversation is a lot more straightforward, because if you have a steel mill that is an existing consumer of hydrogen or a future consumer of hydrogen, they know that they've got the demand. They just need to find the right technology solution to be able to provide that. The other side of that is more of kind of a developer mindset, where you're project financing something that might overlay on top of renewable energy. There, it's very important to think about how long-term and how stable that offtake agreement is. Very similar to, I think, the way that renewable energy ended up being deployed. So I think that the two areas right now, at least in the US, now that we know the economics work because of the Inflation Reduction Act kind of helping to drag costs forward 3 to 5 years, it's do you have an offtake and do you have electrolyzer supply? Because right now there is a pretty large shortage of available hydrogen electrolysis systems. But there's a lot more demand there. So you're absolutely right. It's a key consideration that we really look into before we'll accept an order from a customer. We need to know it will become real and they have a kind of a meaningful use of the hydrogen.
In our final moment together, I want to ask a lightning round question, because we are moments away from our time being up. So if you can answer the following question in just one word: what is one clean energy technology that you're not involved in that intrigues you? Caroline, let's start with you.
Well, hydrogen, basically, because we talk about electricity, but you need it to replace fossil fuels for transportation.
Nuclear fusion.
I would say nuclear energy in general, fusion and advanced fission.
Great. Well, a big thank you to our panelists and the audience for this great conversation.